Want to welcome you back today to GLBC's Connections. Today we're going to talk about Psalm 22. And several people have asked me why the dog is always in the videos. The truth is she's super cuddly and she always wants her spot, and her spot very often is in places that really make the filming of a video very difficult. So in the end I try to put her in the least intrusive spot, which happens to be sitting on my shoulder. So that's why she's sitting there. So here we are again, huh, Stormy? Yep. I want you to know my emotional state. I've talked about this openly in the past. I tend to go up and down over time. Sometimes I feel just great, other times really low. It gets very frustrating. I don't really know why things go like that. I don't really struggle with it mightily, but it happens. But it's my privilege to counsel people who struggle with depression on occasion. And I know that very often they are also very frustrated. And I want you to know, if you struggle with depression or discouragement or anxiety, I know that so often it's out of your control. You don't really understand why it comes and goes or how it comes and goes. I really do get that. And I know so often as I talk to people, they don't know why it sets it off. They'll wake up, think it's going to be a fine day, and then it just isn't, and nothing's really happened. They can't really explain it. It's just a mental state that sort of attacks them. Today, as we talk about Psalm 22, I just want to say that Psalm 22 is designed to be helpful in all kinds of suffering, but I do think it's helpful in those specific kinds of suffering. If we struggle in our emotional state with depression, anxiety, discouragement, grief, whatever the case may be, as we go through those ups and downs in life, no matter how pronounced they are, Psalm 22 really is helpful. The first few words of it are actually very familiar. Psalm 22 is the psalm that Jesus himself quoted when he was crucified, and it starts, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" Many years ago, I heard a pastor say that he thought that Jesus probably quoted the whole thing while he was on the cross. Over the course of time, I've tended to agree that was probably the case. Jesus didn't just stop with the first verse, but continued to the whole thing. The first 21 verses of Psalm 22 are just incredibly poetic, very moving bits of poetry as they talk about what it means to go through a time of suffering, how difficult and challenging it is, and it uses poetic language. And very often I encourage people who struggle with the highs and lows to take such psalms and use them and apply them to their own lives, use them as prayers to God in the midst of suffering. And I want to encourage you, if you go through those highs and lows, Psalm 22 can be very helpful in that way. But also a reminder that as we suffer, so also Jesus suffered. In fact, I should really say it in the opposite way. As Jesus suffered, so also we suffer. And we know that Jesus' suffering leads to his glory. And he talks about this in the Gospel of John, how his suffering leads to glory. But we know that's true for us too. And Paul says this in Romans 8. He says, if we share in his glory, if we are going to share in his glory, we have to share in his suffering. And so often we do. Well, because of that, Psalm 22 helps us through those times of suffering. Just great words of frustration. He starts off talking about how the psalmist feels abandoned by God, and then goes on to talk about how great God is in the life of Israel. But those are words of frustration. If in fact he is great in Israel, the psalmist seems to want to know, why is he not great in our lives? I trust that as you go through those highs and lows, you use psalms of lament such as Psalm 22, or even specifically today. I'd encourage you to read Psalm 22. It's longer, so we don't have time to go through it all. But as you read it, you'll also find that it goes on to its end to become a psalm of praise and thanksgiving for deliverance. And thus we know also that the suffering will not last forever, that the days of difficulty, of anxiety, of grief, of pain, they don't last forever, but rather in his time, God will take care of those things. So there's two things about discouragement and anxiety and suffering that I think I want to say. The first one is, one, it's frustrating, and the psalm gives us those words to help us express our frustration to the Lord, and that's okay. He can take that. If you've never heard this before, the lament psalms, psalms of suffering and pain, are the most common psalms in the Old Testament. God can handle our words of suffering and pain. He can handle them back. But they also give us a language to remind us that God is still in control and that he's still worthy of praise. And so the Psalms of Lament help us express those frustrations well. So if you get frustrated, the Lament Psalms really can help. And secondly, this is a reminder too that it's so often out of our control, the suffering. We don't know why it comes up. Jesus himself, as he was on the cross, knew that it was the Father's plan that he would be there. But even he in Gethsemane said, if it be your will, let this cup pass from me. And so often our suffering really is out of our control. It's not something we've personally done. Sometimes we suffer just because we live in a broken world. Psalm 22 reminds us, as it gets to the end, to the last 9 or 10 verses, that even as we live in a broken world, even as it is difficult, we can trust in the Lord and in his work. So I encourage you to use Psalm 22 this week if you struggle with the highs and lows of life. Use it to express your frustration to God, but also use it to turn those frustrations into praise. And I think that helps our heart and helps us as we go through times of trusting. It helps us to trust in Christ ever more deeply.